November 1st, 1938. Pimlico Racecourse in Baltimore was packed beyond capacity. 40,000 spectators filled the grandstands, their voices rising in a restless roar that rolled across the track like thunder. Across the United States, an estimated 40 million people gathered around radios in living rooms, bars, barbershops, and factory floors. They weren't just waiting for a horse race, they were waiting for a showdown. In one corner stood War Admiral, the sleek Triple Crown champion of the East, a horse bred from racing royalty. In the other stood Seabiscuit, small, crooked-legged, and once considered too lazy to race. Two horses, two very different champions. 2 minutes that would become the most famous race in American history. The year was 1936. America was broken. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Dust storms buried entire farms. And hope seemed as scarce as jobs. Factories stood empty, their smokestacks cold and silent. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed, and those lucky enough to have work barely earned enough to feed their families. The stock market crash of 1929 had shattered more than financial portfolios. It had broken the American spirit itself. People who had once believed in endless possibility now questioned whether tomorrow would be any better than today. But in the forgotten corners of racetracks, where broken dreams and long shots gathered, something extraordinary was about to unfold. This is the story of Seabiscuit, a knobby-kneed, crooked-legged horse that nobody wanted. A horse that looked more like a workhorse than a thoroughbred champion. But this isn't just a horse racing story. This is the story of 3 broken men who found redemption in the most unlikely champion America had ever seen. Charles Howard, once the king of Buick automobiles on the West Coast, had built his empire from nothing, arriving in San Francisco with $21 in his pocket and a vision of putting America on wheels. But money couldn't save his 15-year-old son from a tragic car accident. The man who had built an empire selling the promise of the open road now found that same road had taken everything that mattered. Howard was drowning in grief, desperately searching for something, anything to believe in again. Tom Smith was a weathered cowboy who spoke the language of horses better than he spoke to people. Smith had spent decades breaking mustangs, learning that every horse was an individual with its own personality, its own fears, its own potential. He was a relic from the Old West, a man who could gentle the wildest mustang with nothing but patience and understanding. He saw things in horses that others missed, potential where others saw problems, intelligence where others saw stubbornness. Red Pollard was half-blind in one eye, a failed prize fighter who lived in haylofts and read poetry by candlelight. After his family's brickyard collapsed, they helped him find work at a local track, launching this literary soul into the grueling life of a jockey. He became a reader of poetry whose dreams were constantly tested by the harsh realities of the Depression. Despite weighing more than most jockeys, despite his damaged vision, despite sleeping in horse stalls for lack of money, he refused to give up on the idea that he could ride his way to something better. Before Charles Howard ever saw him, Seabiscuit had already run dozens of races. At 2 years old, he raced constantly, sometimes every few days, pushed hard by trainers who saw him as nothing more than another horse in the stable. He showed flashes of speed, but the constant racing dulled his spirit. Wins were rare, and by the time he was sold, most trainers believed his best days were already behind him. Few imagined that the horse so many had overlooked was still waiting for the right moment, and the right people to reveal his true ability. These 3 men were drawn together by fate. A journey that began in 1934 at a rundown track in Tijuana, Mexico. It was there that Charles Howard, seeking a horse to restore his faith in competition, first hired silent trainer Tom Smith. For 2 years, They searched for a project worthy of Smith's unconventional methods, a horse others had given up on. Their search finally ended in August 1936 when they discovered Seabiscuit and crossed paths with Red Pollard, a struggling jockey desperate for a mount to carry him out of poverty. Born at Claiborne Farm, he was the grandson of the legendary man of war. But noble bloodlines meant nothing when the horse couldn't seem to win a race. He had been trained to lose, used as a workmate to make other horses look good. When they brought him out for Howard to see, Seabiscuit was 20 pounds overweight, his coat dull, his manner listless. But when Tom Smith looked into Seabiscuit's eyes that day, he saw something different. The horse wasn't broken. He was bored. He wasn't lazy. He was uninspired. Smith whispered to Howard, "This horse has it in him to be great. He just needs someone to believe in him." That moment of recognition would change everything, not just for the horse, but for a nation that desperately needed to remember what it meant to believe in long shots. Those early days were physically and mentally tough for Seabiscuit. With his unorthodox paddling gait, he looked clumsy compared to the elegant Eastern thoroughbreds, and racing officials openly questioned his fitness for high-level competition. He was 20 pounds overweight and seemed more interested in sleeping than sprinting, a defense mechanism from a grueling early career where he had been run into the ground. Critics initially dubbed him the people's horse as a backhanded jab at his common appearance and lack of poise. Smith, however, saw potential in that very ordinariness. Instead of the traditional endless laps that had soured the horse's spirit, Smith took Seabiscuit on long, meditative walks through the California hills, letting him regain his curiosity. The true breakthrough came through Smith's unconventional psychological rewiring. To cure the horse of his lethargy at the starting gate, Smith used classical conditioning, employing a loud dinner bell during practice to trigger a sudden explosion of speed. He paired this with a stable menagerie surrounding Seabiscuit with a dog named Pocatello and a monkey named Jojo to calm his frayed nerves. Although there are no known photographs of Seabiscuit, Pocatello, and Jojo together, his most constant companion, a stable pony named Pumpkin, was frequently photographed by his side. The transformation was complete by the time they reached the Michigan State Fairgrounds in September 1936. The clumsy horse had vanished. In his place was a focused athlete who dominated the governor's handicap and followed it up days later by storming home in the Hendry handicap to win by 4 lengths. It was the definitive proof that Seabiscuit's laziness had actually been a champion's fire, finally ignited by the right spark. By 1937, Seabiscuit had become one of the most talked about horses in California. But there was one race that haunted the team, the Santa Anita Handicap, the richest race in America. In that race, Seabiscuit surged down the stretch, closing the gap with every stride. The crowd roared as he lunged for the finish line. But the photo finish told a different story. He had lost to Rosemont by the narrowest margin imaginable, a mere nose. For Howard, Smith, and Pollard, it was a crushing defeat. Yet the near victory only deepened the public's fascination with the unlikely champion. And then everything changed. Seabiscuit began to win. Not just win, dominate. Track after track across California fell before this unlikely champion. His victories weren't elegant. They were gutsy, gritty affairs where he'd surge past the field in the final stretch, his peculiar gait somehow propelling him forward like a force of nature. The working class embraced him completely. Here was a horse that looked like them. Not pretty, not privileged, but determined to succeed against all odds. When Seabiscuit won, it felt like a personal victory for every person who had ever been overlooked or written off. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, another horse was capturing headlines. War Admiral, sleek, aristocratic, the Triple Crown winner who represented everything the old establishment valued. As his shadow lengthened over the racing world, a national obsession took hold. In barbershops, train stations, and crowded city bars, fans argued about which horse truly owned the turf. The debate moved from the sports page to the street corner. Could the scrappy California underdog actually topple the reigning king of the East? Arranging the showdown proved to be a diplomatic nightmare. Owners Samuel Riddle and Charles Howard clashed over every detail: track conditions, distance, and most famously, the starting procedure. Riddle demanded a traditional walk-up start, while Howard pushed for his horse's grit to decide the day. Despite the complications, the public demand was too loud to ignore. Eventually, the bickering ceased, the papers were signed, and the details were settled. The race would happen. Trainer Tom Smith knew the odds. To beat the younger, faster war admiral, he had spent weeks in the shadows, refining his secret weapon, the starting bell. He had conditioned Seabiscuit to ignore the chaos and explode at the sound of the chime, transforming the horse's historically slow start into a lightning-fast break. When race day arrived, 40,000 people packed the stands, while 40 million more leaned into their radios. The bickering of owners and the theories of sports writers fell silent as the most famous horse race in American history finally unfolded. As the date at Pimlico neared, a sudden twist threatened to derail the dream. Red Pollard, the soul of Seabiscuit's success, was still recovering from a terrifying spill on a mare named Fair Nidus. The accident had crushed his chest and broken his ribs, leaving him trapped in a hospital bed while the world's eyes turned toward Baltimore. In his place stepped George the Iceman Wolf, Pollard's closest friend. Wolf was a legend of the turf, a man with a pulse that never seemed to rise above a resting beat, even in the heat of a finish-line sprint. He lived a life of quiet luxury, wearing tailored suits and riding only the finest stakes horses, but his cool exterior hid a dangerous secret. He was a type 1 diabetic in an era before modern medicine, fighting a private battle with exhaustion every time he entered the starting gate. He was the only man Pollard trusted with the biscuit, yet even the Iceman felt the crushing weight of this moment. The night before the race, Wolf visited Pollard's bedside looking for an edge. It was there that Pollard revealed the secret to the horse's soul. He told the Iceman to do the unthinkable, get in front early, but then ease up on the backstretch to let the Admiral catch them. Once a horse gives Seabiscuit the old look in the eye, Pollard said, he begins to run to parts unknown. He told Wolf to let War Admiral come up alongside until his nose is right at Seabiscuit's girth. Only then, Pollard insisted, should Wolf let the biscuit see him. He'll break the Admiral's heart, Pollard promised. On November 1st, the world stopped. At the sound of Smith's perfected starting bell, Seabiscuit didn't just break, he exploded, matching the Triple Crown champion stride for stride in a blistering duel. Following the hospital bed plan, Wolf allowed War Admiral to draw even on the backstretch. For a heart-stopping moment, they ran eye to eye. Just as Pollard predicted, the moment Seabiscuit looked his rival in the face, he found a gear no one knew he had. As they thundered into the final turn, War Admiral began to falter, and Wolf looked over at his rival's jockey with a final taunt. "So long, Charlie." Seabiscuit surged forward, pulling away to win by 4 lengths and leaving the aristocrat in his wake.
Seabiscuit leads by a length. Now Seabiscuit by a length and a half. Wolf has put away his weapon. Seabiscuit by 3. Seabiscuit by 3. Seabiscuit is the winner by 4 lengths.
The reaction was instantaneous. Grown men wept openly in the stands as they watched a horse with knobby knees and a rough gait dethrone the most polished athlete in the world. It was the ultimate proof that in America, greatness wasn't a birthright reserved for the elite. Within hours, extra editions of newspapers screamed the news to a nation still in the grip of the Great Depression. The victory was toasted not just as a sporting win, but as a personal triumph for every American who had been told they weren't enough. Seabiscuit was the proof that you could be broken, cast aside, and still find the strength to refuse to stay down. But triumph turned to tragedy. In early 1939, Red Pollard suffered a devastating leg injury that many believed had ended his riding career for good. The hardship began in February 1938, when Red Pollard suffered a horrific compound fracture in the accident with fairnitis. While he was finally beginning to walk again, a second accident occurred when a horse bolted toward a barn, crushing Pollard's same injured leg against the doorframe and shattering the bone once more. Throughout the 1939 season, the man who had been Seabiscuit's soul was forced to the sidelines, spending the year on crutches while George the Iceman Wolfe took his place in the saddle. Then came the final blow. During the 1939 La Jolla Handicap, a prep race for the Santa Anita Handicap, Seabiscuit faltered as he suffered a ruptured suspensory ligament. The veterinary verdict was unanimous. His racing days were over forever. Both the horse and his jockey were broken, seemingly finished. But Charles Howard chose a different path. At his ranch in California, man and horse recovered together. Pollard would walk with Seabiscuit for hours, both of them limping, both refusing to accept their story was over. For over a year, they fought their way back from injuries that should have ended their dreams. While the racing world moved on, the bond between the two grew stronger in the quiet of the ranch. Pollard, still on crutches for much of the time, found his own strength returning as he watched Seabiscuit's steady progress. It was a period of mutual rehabilitation that defied every veterinary and medical prognosis of the era. The decision to return wasn't made in a single moment, but in a series of small, tentative steps on the dirt paths of Ridgewood Ranch. By late 1939, the broken pair had begun to defy the odds. Pollard, finally off his crutches, began to ease himself back into the saddle while Seabiscuit's gait lost its gingerly limp. They weren't just walking anymore, they were starting to run. But Howard and Smith were cautious. They knew that a failed comeback wouldn't just be a loss. It could be fatal for the horse's legacy and his health. The turning point came during a series of private morning workouts. Smith watched the stopwatch and saw something he didn't expect. The old speed was returning. More importantly, Seabiscuit wasn't just running, he was asking for the lead again, showing the same competitive fire that had broken War Admiral's heart. In early 1940, Howard made the announcement that stunned the racing world. Despite the critics who called it cruel and publicity-seeking, they would enter the Santa Anita Handicap. For Howard, it was about finishing the story on their own terms. For Smith, it was about trusting the horse's silent resilience. And for Pollard, it was the only way to prove he wasn't a cast-off himself. They arrived at Santa Anita not as favorites, but as a question mark that the whole nation was waiting to see answered. They arrived at Santa Anita in early 1940 to the skepticism of the racing world. For the experts, the comeback was a foolish risk. For the public, it was the only story that mattered. But for the team, the final test wasn't in the headlines, it was in the horse's legs during the prep races. In his first two starts back, Seabiscuit finished third and then sixth. The critics pounced, claiming the old champion had lost his top gear and that his injury-prone legs couldn't handle the strain of elite competition. Even some of Howard's closest advisors urged him to retire the horse before his reputation was further tarnished. But Red Pollard and Tom Smith saw what the cameras missed. In those losing efforts, Seabiscuit wasn't giving up, he was getting his sea legs back. He was finding his rhythm, testing the ground, and regaining the lung capacity he had lost during the year at Ridgewood Ranch. Then came a 1.16 handicap race just a week before the big one. Seabiscuit didn't just win, he dominated. He moved with a fluidity that silenced the doubters and set a time that put the rest of the Santa Anita field on notice. The king of cast-offs wasn't just back, he was peaking at the exact moment the 100-grander loomed on the horizon. The 1940 Santa Anita Handicap was more than a race. It was the final chapter of a shared resurrection. Twice before, this 100-grander had slipped through Seabiscuit's grasp, and now, at 7 years old, time was running out. Red Pollard and the champion stood at the gate as a single patched-together unit, two veterans of the same silent war for recovery. They were surrounded by younger, faster rivals, but they carried something the others didn't. A year of grit forged at Ridgewood Ranch and the weight of a nation's hope. As Seabiscuit approached the gate that afternoon, a heavy silence fell over the crowd of 78,000. Many wondered whether the 7-year-old champion, carrying the scars of a supposedly career-ending injury, had a single race left in his heart. Even the most loyal fans quietly feared that the horse who once electrified America was now just a shadow of his former self. But Tom Smith stood calmly near the rail, his eyes fixed on the horse. He didn't see a lost cause, he saw the same stubborn determination he had recognized in a weedy thicket years ago. Smith knew that while the legs were held together by grit and therapy, the spirit remained untouched. He had done his job. Now it was up to the horse. Seabiscuit wasn't just fighting the ghosts of his own injuries. He was up against a field of younger, hungrier champions. Among them was the blazing frontrunner, Witchsea, the stubborn wedding call, and Seabiscuit's own stablemate, Kayak II, the sleek, powerful favorite who many believed represented the future of the sport. The break was clean, but the pace was brutal. Witchsea bolted to the lead, setting a pace designed to break an older horse's heart. For most of the race, Seabiscuit was trapped, smothered by the thunder of hooves and buried in the pack. It looked as though the critics were right until they hit the far turn. Pollard saw his opening. As Witchsea drifted just inches wide, Pollard took a heart-stopping gamble and dove for the rail. He whispered a single word of encouragement, and the transformation began. Under a staggering 130 pounds, Seabiscuit didn't just move, he launched. He sliced past the leaders and, in the final stretch, drew alongside Kayak II. For one heartbeat, the past and the future ran eye to eye. Then, Seabiscuit found it, that impossible acceleration that had made him a legend. He shook off the younger horse and stormed toward the wire. When they crossed the finish line first, breaking the track record, the grandstand didn't just cheer, it erupted. Grown men wept openly, and the roar echoed across the country like a victory bell for everyone who had ever been counted out. The true victory that afternoon wasn't found in the winner's circle. It was found in the quiet transformation of the men who refused to give up. For Charles Howard, who had lost his young son to a tragic accident years before, Seabiscuit was the miracle that finally allowed him to embrace the world again. Through the horse, he moved from a life of mourning into a life of shared joy, proving that even a shattered heart can find a new reason to beat. For Tom Smith, the silent man from the vanishing frontier, Seabiscuit was one of his last great conversations with a world that had moved on without him. He had spent his life among the wild, misunderstood by a modern age that had no place for horse whisperers. In Seabiscuit, he found the one spirit as stubborn and silent as his own, proving that the old ways still held the most profound magic. And for Red Pollard, the redemption was the most personal of all. He had been a nobody, a half-blind, broken-down jockey who slept in haylofts and fought for scraps. On that final stretch, as he leaned into the wind, he wasn't a failure. He was the partner of a king. These were three men the world had stopped looking at, who found a horse the world had stopped believing in. In the end, they didn't just save Seabiscuit, he saved them. By the time he retired, Seabiscuit had become the world's leading money winner, a feat achieved by a horse once discarded to the claiming ranks for his knobby knees and perceived laziness. His career ended where it had found its second life, among the redwoods of Ridgewood Ranch. There, the late-maturing grit that defined his racing years was passed down to a lineage of descendants who still graze those same pastures today. When he passed away in 1947, he wasn't buried as a mere celebrity or a mascot of the Depression. He was laid to rest as a horse that had simply outrun every expectation ever placed upon him.